Welcome back to the Secret Podcast. This episode is my full 40-minute interview with author of Lost Connections, Johann Hari. Why do people, even after they have their basic needs met, with all the tools we have available, why are we not only unhappy, but largely depressed? Johann Hari set out across the world to speak with leading experts on depression, anxiety, and loneliness to discover both how we've gotten to this place and, more importantly, how do we as individuals and a society start to turn the tide. All right, so why don't we start out with a little bit of an intro about yourself and about your work.
I wrote my book Lost Connections because there were these two mysteries that were really hanging over me for years. I think I was quite afraid to look into them in some ways. The first mystery is I'm 40 years old, and every year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety have increased here in the United States, in Britain, and across the Western world, right? And I kept asking myself, why? Why is this happening? Why are so many more of us each year that passes finding it hard to get through the day, right? And I guess I wanted to understand that because of a more personal mystery. When I was a teenager, I remember going to my doctor and explaining that I had this feeling like pain was leaking out of me. That's how I put it at the time. And I felt very ashamed of it. I felt confused by it. I didn't understand why it was happening. And my doctor told me a story that I now realise from speaking to the leading scientists in the world on this was oversimplified, right? My doctor said, we know why people feel like this. It's just because of a problem in your brain. There's a chemical called serotonin that makes people feel good. Some people are naturally lacking it. You're clearly one of them. All we need to do is give you some drugs. You're going to feel better. So I started taking a chemical antidepressant called Paxil, and I felt significantly better for a few months. And then this feeling of pain came back. So I went back. The doctor said, well, I didn't give you a high enough dose. I was given a high dose. Again, I felt better. Again, the feeling of pain came back. And I was really in this cycle of taking higher and higher doses until for 13 years I was taking the maximum dose you're allowed to take, at the end of which I was still really depressed. And I was surrounded by people who were becoming more and more depressed. So I just forced myself really to start looking into this. So I ended up going on this big journey for the book. I travelled over 40,000 miles. I wanted to meet the leading experts in the world about what causes depression and anxiety and what solves them, most importantly. So I met, not just leading experts, but just a crazy mixture of people with different perspectives, from an Amish village in Indiana, because the Amish have very low levels of depression, to a city in Brazil that banned advertising to see if that would make people feel better, to a lab in Baltimore where they were giving people psychedelics to see if that would help. And I learned a huge number of things, but the core of what I learned is that there's scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety. 2 of them are in fact biological. My doctor wasn't wrong. Your genes can make you more vulnerable to these problems, just like some people find it easier to put on weight than others. And there are real changes in your brain that begin when you become depressed that can make it harder to get out. But most of the factors that cause depression and anxiety are not in our biology. Most of the factors for which there's scientific evidence are factors in the way we're living. And what I learned in the process of writing the book and speaking to so many scientists is, once you understand the causes of depression and anxiety in this more complex way, it opens up a much broader range of possible solutions that I saw being put into practice all over the world. And these are solutions that we need to be explaining to people and offering to them alongside, not instead of, but as an option alongside chemical antidepressants.
Why is society at large reacting in this way? What do you think are some of the influences on people's well-being that's leading to the higher and higher rates of depression and anxiety?
Well, I'll give you an example of one of the 9 causes that I wrote about in Lost Connections. We are the loneliest society there's ever been. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing this years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer, not the average, but the most common answer is none. Half of all Americans asked how many people know you well say nobody, right? I spent a lot of time talking to an amazing man called Professor John Cacioppo, who was the leading expert in the world on loneliness. He was at the University of Chicago. And he explained to me, why are we alive? You and me and everyone watching this. Why do we exist? One key reason is that our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. They weren't bigger than the animals they took down. They weren't faster than the animals they took down, but they were much better at banding together into groups and cooperating. Just like bees evolved to live in a hive, humans evolved to live in a tribe. And if you think about the circumstances where we evolved, if you were cut off from the tribe, you were depressed and anxious for really good reasons. You were in terrible danger. You were about to die. Those are still the impulses we have. We are the first humans ever in the long 2 million year history of our species to try to disband our tribes. And it is making us feel awful. So a key thing for me was not just to understand these problems, but okay, how do we solve those problems, right? And one of the heroes of my book Lost Connections is an amazing man called Dr. Sam Everington, who pioneered a whole different approach based on this understanding. So Sam was a general practitioner in East London, a poor part of East London where I lived for a long time. And Sam was really uncomfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, he thinks there's some role for chemical antidepressants, but he could also see most of the people he was giving them to did become depressed again. And he could see that they were depressed and anxious for perfectly understandable reasons, right? Like, to give one of the examples I talk about in the book, loneliness. So he decided to pioneer a different approach. One day a woman came to see him called Lisa Cunningham, who'd been shut away in her home with dreadful depression and anxiety for 7 years. And Sam said to Lisa, don't worry, I'll carry on giving you these drugs. I'm also going to suggest something else. There was an area behind the suite of doctors' offices that was known as Dog Shit Alley, which gives you a sense of what it was like, just kind of scrubland. Sam said to Lisa, what I'd like you to come and do is turn out a few times a week. I'm going to come too because I've been pretty anxious. We're going to meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people. We're going to find something to do together as a group, right? The first time the group met, Lisa was literally physically sick with anxiety. But the group starts talking, they're like, what can we do? These are inner city East London people, they don't know anything about gardening. They decided they were going to teach themselves gardening, right? Going to turn Dog Shit Alley into a beautiful garden. So they start to watch YouTube, they start to read books, they start to get their fingers in the soil. They start to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence that exposure to the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. They start to do something even more important. They started to form a tribe. They started to form a group. They started to care about each other. If one person didn't turn up, they'd go and look for them. They'd see if they were okay. They did what human beings do when we're part of tribes. They started to solve each other's problems. The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a study in Norway of a very similar program, found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. I think for an obvious reason, right? It was dealing with some of the reasons why they felt so bad in the first place. And this is something I saw all over the world, from Sydney to Sao Paulo to San Francisco. The most effective strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the reasons why we're in such distress in the first place.
It seems like today we have a lot of distractions that could potentially pull us away from that connection. It seems like a lot of people are driven through consumerism and materialism, and many of us are safer and have more than we ever have before. The size of homes has increased steadily since the 1930s and 40s. Is there any correlation between material wealth and happiness?
One of the things I found most challenging in the research for the book, because I could see how much it had played out in my own life, was some research by an amazing man called Professor Tim Kasser. So everyone knows junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? As you can tell from my chins, I'm not immune to this myself. But there's equally strong evidence that a kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick. Professor Kasser showed, so for thousands of years, philosophers have said, if you think life is about money and status and showing off, you're going to feel like shit, right? It's not an exact quote from Confucius, but that is the gist of what he said, right? But no one had scientifically investigated this until Professor Kasser. And he showed a few, I think, really important things. Firstly, he showed the more you think life is about money and status and showing off, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious by a really quite significant amount. I think this is because, I'm going a little bit beyond Professor Kasser here, but I think this is because everyone knows they have natural physical needs, right? You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And our culture is good at lots of things. I'm glad to be alive today, but we've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. If you think, partly because there's many factors going on, but partly because if you think life is about money and displaying that money, that is going to divert you from the things you actually do need to have a meaningful and satisfying life. But Professor Kasser also showed something else. So he showed the more you follow these junk values, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious. He also showed, as a society, as a culture, we have become much more driven by these junk values. It's a cliche to say to your viewers, you won't lie on your deathbed and think about all the likes you got on Instagram and all the shoes you bought, right? You'll think about moments of love and meaning and connection in your lives. But as Professor Kasser puts it, we live in a machine that's designed to get us to neglect what is important about life, right? More 18-month-old children know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name. We're immersed in a machinery that tells us how to do this. And Professor Kasser did really interesting research about how we undo some of that. And some of it was really simple. He got a group of people to meet once every couple of weeks for 4 months and just talk about, firstly, consumer objects they thought they had to have, things like Nike sneakers. Once they talked out loud, well, how do you think your life will be different when you've got them? It didn't take long for people to start saying, oh, maybe this is bullshit that's been implanted in my head by advertising. But then the more important bit was they got people to talk about, well, what are moments, that's not a moment that's going to make you feel satisfied. What are moments you have actually felt your life was meaningful, satisfying? We'll talk about different things. For some people it was playing music, for some people it was swimming, for some people it was riding, whatever it was. And they started to say, well, how could you build more of that into your life, seeking more of that and doing more of that, and less of seeking this kind of junk values stuff. And just that process of meeting every couple of weeks and checking in with each other and explaining how they tried to do it led to a measurable, they did a good scientific study of this, a measurable shift in people's values to become less materialistic, which we know relates to less depression and anxiety. Now, of course, it's the case that, and a guy called Professor Richard Layard has done research on this, if you don't have a baseline of material goods, right, if you are in poverty, that makes you, then you are going to be unhappy. But once you've actually reached a fairly low level of income that you're not actually wanting for basic things, additional money makes you no happier, and actually constantly seeking it leads to a corruption of values that makes you significantly more unhappy.
A lot of times we talk about basic needs, as in shelter, money, food on the table, but I guess you're in a lot of ways suggesting that we expand what basic needs really are. And a lot of times you don't need the house, the car, and all that stuff to have this deep connection with other people.
Well, let's think about a really important aspect of this, which relates to how we spend most of our waking lives, right? I noticed lots of the people I know who are depressed and anxious, the depression and anxiety focuses around their work. So I started to look at how do we actually feel about our work? It was a big study by Gallup, the opinion poll company, that looked at this. It found 13% of us, 13%, like our jobs most of the time. 63% of people are what they called sleepworking. You don't like it, you don't hate it, you just kind of tolerate it. And 24% of people hate and fear their jobs. 87% of people don't like the thing they're doing most of the time. And this thing that we don't like is spreading over more and more of the day, right? The average person now answers their first work email at 7:43 a.m. and clocks out at 7:15 p.m. I started to ask, could this be having some effect on our mental health, right? I started to look around at the evidence, and I learned that an amazing Australian social scientist called Professor Michael Marmot had discovered in the 1970s the key factor that causes depression at work. It's not the only one, but it's the key factor. I went to go and see him. The key factor is if you go to work tomorrow and you have low or no control over your work, you are much more likely to become depressed and anxious. I think I'm going a little bit beyond Professor Marmot here, but I think this is because you need to feel your life has meaning. And if you're controlled by somebody else, it disrupts your ability to make meaning out of your work, right? To believe that what you're doing has value. But I actually misunderstood what this evidence showed at first. I remember learning all this and thinking, oh wait, so is what we're saying here that you've got this elite 13% of people who get to have jobs they like, And then you've got everyone else who's condemned to this, controlled, miserable life. I was like, well, hang on a minute. What about my brother is an Uber driver, my dad was a bus driver, my grandmother's job was to clean toilets. Are we saying that they're, condemned to this controlled life? And Professor Marmot explained to me, it's not the work that makes you depressed. It's being controlled at work. And it turns out there are solutions to that. So in Baltimore, I went to go and see a woman called Meredith Keogh. And Meredith used to go to bed every Sunday night sick with anxiety. She had an office job, but she would tell you it wasn't the worst office job in the world. She wasn't being bullied or harassed. But it was really monotonous. She was controlled all the time. She just couldn't bear the thought this was going to be the next 40 years of her life. So one day, with her husband Josh, she did this quite bold thing. Josh had worked in bike stores since he was a teenager, which is, controlled, insecure work. And one day, Josh was with his colleagues in the bike store, and they just said to themselves one day, what does our boss actually do? They liked their boss. He wasn't a terrible person, but they were like, we seem to fix all the bikes and he seems to make all the money, right? It doesn't seem like such a good deal for us. They decided to leave and set up a bike store of their own, but one that worked on a different principle. The previous place they had worked was a corporation. Most people watching the video will work in corporations, right? You know how it works. It's very recent human invention, but it's like an army. The guy at the top is like the dictator, and sometimes he's a dictator who listens to you, and sometimes she isn't, or whatever. But you either obey the dictator or you leave, right? They decided they were going to set up a bike store that worked on a different principle, an older American idea. The bike store they set up, Baltimore Bicycle Works, is a democratic cooperative. They don't have a boss. They run the business together. They take the decisions collectively. They have a meeting once every couple of weeks. They share the profits. They share out the good tasks and the shitty tasks, so no one gets stuck with the shitty tasks. And one of the things that was totally fascinating to me, spending time with them, totally in line with Professor Marmot's findings, was how many of them talked about how they had been depressed and anxious in this previous way of working, but were not depressed and anxious in this new way of working. Now, it's important to say, it's not like they quit their jobs fixing bikes and went off to become Beyonce's backing singers, right? They fixed bikes before they fix bikes now. The difference is now they've got control over their work. There is no reason why we should be structuring our economy so that most people are spending their time being controlled and humiliated. We don't have to do that. Every business could be turned from a corporation into a democratic cooperative. Now, that's a big change, but everyone listening to us talk has lived through big changes, right? I'm gay. I didn't even hear the concept of gay marriage till I was 21. The women watching don't need me to mansplain this, but my grandmothers weren't even allowed to have bank accounts in their own names once they got married, right? We are all the weekend was a crazy radical idea when it was first proposed by labour unions in the late 19th century, right? We're all the beneficiaries of ideas that seemed radical and impossible at the start, but then were introduced. We cannot continue working in situations that maximise depression and unhappiness, right? How many people do you know who are depressed and anxious, who'd feel very differently if they knew that tomorrow they were going into a workplace that they controlled with their colleagues, where they set their priorities, where if there has to be a boss, he's accountable to them rather than the other way around, just the other way around. That's a very different way of spending most of our waking lives, and one that significantly reduces depression and anxiety.
You said that we're living in the loneliest society there's ever been. How can that possibly be with all of these tools at our fingertips, right? We have social media, we have the ability to connect and interact with anybody in an instant. I can FaceTime my mom in a second, and if she picks up, then I can see her face to face. Has social media played some part in the fact that we are lonely?
This is a complex question and with a complex answer. So the glib answer is to go, yeah, social media did this to us. It's just too simplistic. To understand this, I went to the first ever internet rehab center in the world. It's just outside Spokane in Washington State. It's called Restart Washington. I remember I arrived there. It's a clearing in the woods. I got out the car, and absolutely instinctively, I looked at my phone to check my email and felt really pissed off that I couldn't see it because there was no reception. I was like, oh wait, you came to the right place, right? And I spent a fair bit of time there, and it was totally fascinating. They get a whole range of people at Restart Washington, but they disproportionately get young men who become obsessed with these multiplayer role-player games like World of Warcraft, or not at the time that I was there, but now Fortnite, right? And I remember Dr. Hilary Cash, the amazing woman who runs this centre, saying to me, look, you've got to ask yourself, what are these young men getting out of these games? Because they're getting something, right? I think what they're getting is a kind of hollow version of the things they used to get from the society, but they no longer get. They get a sense of a tribe. They get a sense of status and that they can gain in status. They get a sense they're good at something. They get a sense they're moving around. Young people barely leave their homes now. It's incredible, the figures for how rarely children play outdoors. But what they're getting is, I started to think that the relationship between, say, these games or social media and social life is like the relationship between porn and sex, right? I'm not against porn. It'll meet a certain basic itch. But if your entire sex life consisted of looking at porn, you'd be going around pissed off and irritated the whole time, because we didn't evolve to masturbate over screens, we evolved to have sex, right? That wouldn't meet your deeper needs. In the same way, I'm obviously not against the internet, it'd be ridiculous, right? But we didn't evolve to talk through screens, right? We didn't evolve to look at each other and interact with our friends through screens. If you and I were speaking even via Skype now, I wouldn't feel you were seeing me and you wouldn't feel you were the other way around, in the way that we feel that we are seeing and hearing each other now, right? Human beings have a need to be seen. The leading expert on loneliness in the world, Professor John Cacioppo, gave me a good little rule of thumb. He said, if social media is a way station for meeting people offline or staying in touch with them that you'll see offline, it's a good thing. If it's the last stop on the line, generally something's gone wrong. But I think we have to think about as well the moment in human history when social media arrives, right? A lot of the causes of depression and anxiety that I write about in my book, Lost Connections, were already supercharged by then, by the late 90s, the early 2000s. Loneliness had gone up, junk values had gone up, a whole range of things. And what happens is the internet arrives and it looks a lot like the things we've lost. You've lost friends? Here's a load of Facebook friends. You've lost status? Make some status updates, right? But it's not the thing we've lost. It's a kind of parody of the thing we've lost. And what we need to do in very practical ways is restore the thing we've lost.
That's a difficult thing to do, especially considering how addictive social media can be and how they're often engineered for us to spend more and more time on these devices. So how can we start to break away from social media and then start to build those relationships more in person?
There's one place more than any other where the people were not scientists that taught me what's gone wrong and how to put it right. In the summer of 2011, on a big anonymous housing project in Berlin, a German-Turkish woman called Nuria Cengiz climbed out of her wheelchair and put a sign in her window. She was on the ground floor, and the sign said something like, I got a notice saying next Thursday I'm going to be evicted, so on Wednesday night I'm going to kill myself. Now this was, like a big anonymous housing project anywhere. No one really knew anyone. It was in what had been a very poor part of Berlin. So there were basically three groups of people who lived there. There were recent Muslim immigrants like this woman Nuria, there were gay men, and there were punk squatters. And as you can imagine, these three groups would look at each other with confusion, and no one knew anyone. No one knew this woman. But people walked past and they see the sign in the window, and people started to knock on Nuria's door. They said, do you need any help? She said, no, fuck you, I don't want any help. Shut the door in their face. But people started talking outside her apartment, people who had never met before. And a lot of people were being evicted from this housing project. Rents had been going up year after year. So they knew that they might be next. And one of them had an idea. This was, you might remember, the summer of the revolution in Egypt. She saw it on the television and had this idea. There's a big thoroughfare that goes through this housing project, which is called Kotti, into the centre of Berlin. One of them had the idea, if we just block the road on Saturday and we come and protest, we wheel Nuria out, there'll probably be a bit of media coverage, there'll be a bit of a fuss, they'll probably let her stay in her apartment, there might even be some pressure to keep our rents down, right? So they decided to do it. They blocked the road, Nuria was like, I'm going to kill myself anyway. I might as well let them push me into the middle of the street. She sits there. There is a media fuss that day in Berlin. It's on local news. And then it gets to the end of the day and the police say, okay, you've had your fun. Take it down, right? Go back home. And the people who lived in Kotti said, well, hang on a minute. You haven't told Nuria she gets to stay. Actually, we want a rent freeze for our entire housing project and for her to be guaranteed she can stay. Once we've got both these things, we'll take this little barricade they put in the middle of the road down. But of course they knew the minute they left, the police would just tear it down anyway. So one of my favourite people in Kotti, a woman called Tanya Gartner, who's one of the punk squatters, she's quite hardcore. She wears little tiny miniskirts even in Berlin winters. Tanya had an idea. She went up to her apartment where she had a klaxon, things that make loud noises at soccer matches. She brought it down and she said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to drop a timetable to man this barricade 24 hours a day till we get what we want. If the police come to take it down, I'll let off the klaxon and we'll all come down from our apartments and we'll stop them. So people start signing up to man this barricade, right? People who had never met, would never have met. Unlikely pairings. So Nuria, very religious Muslim in her full hijab, was paired with Tanya in her tiny little miniskirt, right? I forget what night shift they got, but they got the night shifts. And a few nights a week. And they sat there. First few nights they're sitting there, they're like, got nothing to talk about. It's super awkward. We couldn't be more different. As the nights went on, Nuria and Tanya started to talk. They discovered they had something incredibly powerful in common. Nuria explained that she'd come to Berlin when she was 16 years old from her village in Turkey. She had 2 young children and she'd come to Berlin to earn enough money to send back for her husband. But after she'd been in Berlin for a year and a half, she got word from home that her husband had died. She'd always told people her husband had died of a heart attack, but sitting there in the cold in the night in Kotti, Nuria told Tanya something she'd never told anyone in Berlin. She explained that her husband had actually died of tuberculosis, which had been seen as a kind of shameful disease of poverty. That's when Tanya told Nuria something she very rarely talked about. She had come to Kotti when she was 15, slightly younger than Nuria. She'd been thrown out by her middle-class family, and she found her way to a punk squat in Kotti, and quite quickly she got pregnant. They realised they had both been kind of children with children of their own in this place they hadn't understood. They realised how much they had in common. This was happening with all sorts of pairings all over Kotti. Directly opposite this housing project, there's a gay club called Südblock, opened by a man called Richard Strauss, who I love, that was opened a couple of years before these protests began. It's a pretty hardcore gay club. To give you a sense of what they're like, the previous place Richard owned was called Café Anal. I always think you don't want to have a sandwich from Café Anal, but and when this club had opened, there's a lot of religious Muslims in this neighbourhood. Some of them had smashed the windows. There'd been real anger about this. When the protests began, Südblock, this gay club, started giving all their furniture. They started, helping out. And after a while, they started saying to the protesters, you guys could have all your meetings in our club if you want. We'll give you free food. We'll give you free drinks. And even the lefties at Kotti were like, we're not going to get these really religious Muslims to come and have meetings underneath posters for fisting night, right? It's not going to happen. It did start to happen. As one of the Turkish German women put it to me, we all realised we had to take these small steps to get to understand each other. After the protest had been going on for about a year, one day a guy turned up called Tunkai. Tunkai was at the time in his early 50s, and it's clear when you speak to him he's got some kind of cognitive difficulties. He's got a misshaped palate. And he'd been living homeless, but he's got an amazing energy about him. He started offering to help, and there were loads of things he helped with. By this time, they had actually turned their protest in the street into a permanent structure, blocking the street, because loads of them are construction workers. And after a few days, everyone loved Tunkai. They started saying to him, we don't want you to be homeless. You should live in this thing we've built, right? It's quite a nice construction. You should just live here. So Tunkai started living there, and he became a much-loved part of this protest camp. And after he'd been there for about 9 months, one day the police came to inspect. They would do this every now and then. Tunkai doesn't like it when people argue, and he thought the police officers were arguing, so he went to hug one of them. That was the police officer thought that Tunkai was attacking them, so they arrested him. That was when it was discovered. Tunkai had been shut away in a psychiatric hospital, often literally in a padded cell, for 20 years. He'd escaped one day, been on the streets for a few months and found his way to Kotti. So the police took him back to the psychiatric hospital right the other side of Berlin. At which point, the entire Kotti protest turned into a free Tunkai movement, right? They descend on this psychiatric hospital. And these psychiatrists are like, what is this? They've got these women in hijabs, these very camp gay men, and these punks demanding the release of someone they've had shut away for 20 years. Like, who are you? I remember Uli Hartmann, one of the protesters, explaining to them, but you don't love him. He doesn't belong with you. We love him. He belongs with us. Many things happened at Kotti. They got Tunkai back. It took a while. They got a rent freeze for their entire housing project. They then launched a referendum initiative to keep rents down across Berlin that got the largest number of written signatures in the history of the city of Berlin. But I remember the last time I saw Nuria, the woman who began all this, with the sign in her window. She said to me, look, I'm really glad I got to stay in my neighbourhood. But I gained so much more than that. I was surrounded by these incredible people all along, and I would never have known. Another one of the Turkish German women in Kotti, a woman called Neriman Tanker, said to me, when I grew up in Berlin, she said to me, when I grew up in Turkey, I called my whole village home. I grew up in a village and I called my whole village home. And then I came to live in the Western world and I learned that what we're meant to call home here is just your four walls. And if you're lucky, your family. And then this whole protest began. And I started to call this whole place and all these people my home. And she said she realized in some sense in this culture she had been homeless and that we are, many of us, homeless. That the Bosnian writer Alexander Heyman said, home is where people notice when you're not there. Right? By that standard, a lot of us are homeless. And I realized that what they were doing in Kotti was building this sense of home together. I remember one time sitting with Tanya outside Ziblock and her saying to me, when you feel like shit and you're all alone, you think there's something wrong with you. But what we did is we came out of our corner crying and we started to fight. And we realized we were surrounded by people who felt the same way. And to me, this was the most important insight I learned from my book, Lost Connections. These people, think about how distressed they were. Nuria was about to kill herself. Tunkai was shut away in a padded cell. Loads of these people were terribly depressed. They didn't, in the main, need to be drugged. They needed to be together. They needed a sense of purpose. They needed a tribe. They needed to know that they were loved and valued and seen. And we've created a culture that doesn't give people that sensation. And one of the things that was so important to me about Kotti, I think you can tell that I really love these people. They're amazing. But in one sense, they're not exceptional. They were a completely random selection of people who happened to live in one housing project. This hunger for reconnection is just beneath the surface all around us, right? We are surrounded by people who have the sense of lack that we all have, right? That something is not right with the way we're living. And there is such when people begin that process of reconnection, it is so potent. It is just close to the surface, this need for a better way of living. And so, in a sense, where it begins is, where did it begin with Nuria? It begins with reaching out to the people around you, right? And I think a lot of people will be surprised by how many people respond when that process begins.
It's hard making friends as an adult. It's one thing that I've found is it was way easier to make friends when I'm in high school, when I'm in college, when you're kind of forced into these group dynamics. And then I've noticed as we get older, we kind of silo ourselves into individual relationships. We have far fewer of them, but it'll just be one-on-one. Let's grab a coffee, let's grab a beer. There's less of that group dynamic, which would feel more like a tribe or a community. Do you have advice for people who are looking to build stronger, deeper connections if they are one of those many people who say they have zero?
Part of it is about a reorientation. In Berkeley, I interviewed this woman called Dr. Brett Ford, who told me about a study she'd done that in some ways is unbelievably simple and yet I found really transformative. embarrassingly transformative, actually. So with her colleagues, Dr. Ford did this research. They were looking at a really simple question. If you decided you were going to spend an hour a day trying to make yourself happier, consciously and deliberately trying to be happier, would you actually become happier? And with other teams, they did this research in 4 countries: the United States, Russia, Japan, and Taiwan. And what they found at first seems really odd. In the United States, if you try to make yourself happier deliberately, you do not become happier. But in the other countries, if you try to make yourself happier, you do. And they were like, what's going on? How can that be? What they discovered was, in the United States, when we try to make ourselves happier, generally what we do is something for ourselves, for me, right? I work harder to buy something. I show off on Instagram. I achieve something for myself, right? In the other countries, in general, when you tried to make yourself happy, you did something for someone else, your friends, your family, your community. So we have an instinctively individualistic idea of what it means to be happy. They have an instinctively collective idea of what it means to be happy. And it turns out our vision of happiness just doesn't work very well, right? A species of individualists would have died out on the savannas of Africa. You wouldn't get to the point where we'd even be here, right? And I found that challenging because I realised how often, not always, but how often when I had felt myself becoming depressed in the past, my general response was to do something for myself, right? Work harder, achieve more, show off in some way. And after I learned this from Dr. Ford, now when I feel these painful feelings coming, which I still do sometimes, I make myself do something for someone else. And, I'm not like Oprah, sadly. I can't turn up and give them a car. But, I can leave my phone at home and go and listen to them, right? And sit with them and be present with them. And in a society where people are so unseen and unheard, that is a really powerful thing to give people, right? You can give people your presence. You can really listen to them and pay attention to them and think about their lives, right? And I think this is the shift we need to make. This is what people in Coty did. They shifted from this individualistic way of being to a collective way of being. And God, was it transformative for them, and was it transformative for me?
We talked a little bit before we sat down here about Marie Kondo and minimalism and this movement of people rejecting consumerism and materialism to live with less stuff, to purchase less things, to focus less on status in their lives. Do you think, I'm curious just what your thoughts on this movement towards less is, and if you think in some way it will help people figure out their values again and reset these junk values that we've created for ourselves.
I haven't looked into it in a huge amount of detail, but we live in a hurricane of messages telling us the answer to our pain and distress lies in shopping, right? There's this really interesting study that was done in 1978. It's really simple. You get a bunch of 5-year-olds and you divide them into 2 groups. First group is shown 2 advertisements for whatever the equivalent to like Dora the Explorer or the Teletubbies was in 1978. I forget what it was. Second group is shown no advertisements. Then all the kids are told, hey kids, you've got a choice now. You can either play with a nice boy who doesn't have the toy in the advertisement, or you can play with a nasty boy who's got the toy. The kids who'd seen just 2 advertisements overwhelmingly chose the nasty boy who had the toy, and the kids who hadn't seen the advertisements overwhelmingly chose the nice boy who didn't have the toy, right? So just 2 ads, just 2, were enough to prime those kids to choose an inanimate lump of plastic over the possibility of fun and connection, right? Every single person watching your video has seen more than 2 ads today, right? More than 2 advertising messages. So we're living in this hurricane of messages bombarding us with a very particular... Before advertising sells any specific product, it sells the idea that the solution lies in purchasing things, right? I mean, imagine advertising is the ultimate frenemy, right? It's saying, babe, I love you. I think you're great. If only you didn't stink. I mean, I'm just saying, if only you weren't so hairy. Just saying, right? It's the ultimate, the premise of it is it has to make you dissatisfied, right? I mean, in the if you look at what advertising people say internally to each other, they're very candid about this. They call them invented wants, right? Because actually, the things that we need are relatively limited. The whole machinery has to be built around making us feel inadequate and then making us buy the solution, right? So I think movements that say, I'm just going to purge this shit, right? That is not the answer, right? Of course, there are nice things. We all like to have nice things. I have some nice things. But the idea that this ceaseless treadmill of buying and displaying useless bullshit, the idea that we might want to step off that treadmill and go, maybe I've got a limited amount of time in which to be alive. Maybe I'll spend my time on things that are more meaningful, seems to me to be a really positive step.
Thanks for watching and listening. I'll be back with another episode on Friday. It's going to be an AMA from the desert. I'll see you there.